the spring of 1945, in a requisitioned farmhouse somewhere along the Rhine, a German staff officer sat across a wooden table from an American intelligence captain and shook his head. He had studied the American army for years. On paper, in briefings, in the confident dismissals passed around Berlin's War College in the years before the guns began to fire. He knew the numbers. He knew the doctrine. He knew, or believed he knew, exactly what the United States could and could not do. He was wrong about almost all of it. This is a story about that wrongness. Not the wrongness of stupidity, but the wrongness of men who were, by every measure, some of the finest professional soldiers the modern world had produced. Men trained from boyhood in the Prussian tradition. Men who had conquered Poland in weeks and France in a month. Men who looked at the United States Army in 1940 and saw a toy. 170,000 men. Cavalry still riding horses. Tanks that a panzer officer would have been embarrassed to command. A nation that had spent 2 decades telling itself that the ocean would keep it safe. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it would become. Over the next 4 years, the German High Command would be forced, again and again, to revise an assessment they did not want to revise. Each revision came stapled to a battlefield report, a captured supply manifest, a prisoner interrogation, a photograph taken from a reconnaissance plane over a French port that made an intelligence officer stop, stare, and ask his aide to check the numbers twice. The story of the American Army in the Second World War is, in large part, the story of German disbelief being dismantled piece by piece, until surrender was the only sentence left to write. Tonight we go back through 7 of those moments. 7 convictions the German officer corps carried into this war, certain they would hold. 7 walls that came down. Think, for a moment, about what confidence looks like from the inside. It rarely feels like arrogance to the people who hold it. It feels like common sense. It feels like the natural conclusion of everything you have been trained to see. The German officer corps of the 1930s was not staffed by fools or fanatics alone. It was staffed by career professionals, men who had studied campaign histories, who understood logistics, who had watched their own nation rebuild a shattered military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles and turn it, within a few short years, into the most feared land force in Europe. If Germany could do that in a decade, starting from a disarmed rump army of 100,000 men permitted under Versailles restrictions, then surely they understood, better than most, what it took to build a serious military machine from nothing. And by that same expert judgment, what they saw in the United States before the war did not measure up. Not the training. Not the industry. Not, they believed, the will. That is what makes this story worth telling in detail rather than summary. It is not a story about a foolish enemy. It is a story about careful, professional, deeply experienced military minds getting the single largest strategic judgment of their careers wrong, not through carelessness, but through the ordinary human failure of underestimating what a determined, well-resourced adversary can do once fully provoked. Understanding exactly how they were wrong, point by point, campaign by campaign, tells us something not just about the Second World War, but about the danger of mistaking a nation's peacetime posture for its wartime potential. This is the story of what the German army refused to believe, until it could no longer afford not to. Heading: the nation that could not build an army. To understand German confidence, you first have to understand German memory. In 1940, the officers who would plan the war against the United States were men shaped by a very specific education. Many of them had served in the First World War, and many of them remembered a particular, uncomfortable fact from that conflict. The American Expeditionary Force that arrived in France in 1917 had been raw, undertrained, and desperately dependent on French and British equipment. American soldiers went into the trenches wearing British helmets and carrying French rifles. Their artillery, their tanks, even many of their aircraft belonged to their allies. It had taken the United States the better part of a year just to get a meaningful force onto the continent, and even then, German veterans of that war remembered the Americans as brave but green, a nation of enthusiastic amateurs playing at a game the Europeans had already been mastering and dying for since 1914. That memory did not fade. It calcified into doctrine. By the late 1930s, the United States Army had shrunk to a size that seemed to confirm every assumption. In 1939, the regular United States Army numbered around 174,000 men, smaller than the Army of Portugal, smaller than Romania's, ranked by some counts somewhere between 16th and 20th in the world. Its most senior general, George Marshall, commanded a force that trained with wooden mock-ups of tanks and trucks labeled with signs because there weren't enough real vehicles to go around. Soldiers on maneuvers in Louisiana carried broomsticks in place of rifles. There was no meaningful mechanized doctrine to speak of. Isolationism was not a fringe position in American politics. It was close to a national consensus, backed by powerful voices in Congress and in the press who saw no reason the United States should involve itself in another European war. German military attaches stationed in Washington filed reports confirming exactly what Berlin wanted to hear. America, they wrote, was a commercial nation, not a martial one. Its people were soft, its politics were paralyzed by factionalism, and even if it wanted to build a serious army, the reasoning went, it would take years the Wehrmacht did not intend to give it. Adolf Hitler himself made little secret of his contempt. He viewed the United States as a mongrel society, racially and culturally incapable of producing the kind of disciplined, martial spirit that had built the Wehrmacht. When he declared war on the United States in December 1941, days after Pearl Harbor, he did so not out of fear, but out of something closer to disdain, a conviction that whatever America sent across the Atlantic would arrive too late, too soft, and too disorganized to matter. What German planners did not fully account for was velocity. They had measured America's army. They had not measured America's capacity to become one. Marshall had spent years quietly preparing contingency plans, cultivating a small cadre of officers who would go on to command corps and armies, and lobbying for a peacetime draft that passed Congress in September 1940 by a single vote. That single vote is one of the great hinge moments of the 20th century, and almost nobody in Berlin was watching it. From that sliver of a majority, an army began to grow at a pace that had no precedent in American history. Within 2 years, the force that had numbered under 200,000 men would grow past 8 million. Camps that had been cow pastures in 1940 were training grounds for entire divisions by 1942. Officers who had commanded companies were commanding regiments within 18 months, not because the army was careless, but because the mathematics of expansion demanded it, and demanded men rise to meet responsibilities the old peacetime army would have given them a decade to earn. German intelligence continued, for a surprisingly long time, to underrate the seriousness of this expansion, filing reports as late as 1942 that questioned whether American formations reaching North Africa and later Europe would hold up against veteran German troops. The clash at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943 seemed, briefly, to confirm every doubt. Green American units, outmaneuvered and badly mauled by Rommel's Afrika Korps, in a defeat sharp enough that it became a byword for American inexperience. But Kasserine did something German planners did not anticipate. It taught the Americans faster than it reassured the Germans. Commanders were relieved. Doctrine was rewritten in the field within weeks. Units that had been embarrassed in February were pushing back with real skill by May. The army that could not fight, according to the German assessment, had absorbed a defeat and turned it into a curriculum, and it kept doing that campaign after campaign, at a rate of institutional learning that unsettled German officers who had assumed defeat would break American morale rather than sharpen American method. By the time American divisions were fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, German officers who had once dismissed the U.S. Army as a commercial nation's hobby project were writing reports of a very different character. Reports that used words like resourceful, aggressive, and, most grudgingly of all, professional. The nation that supposedly could not build an army had built one of the largest and most effective ground forces in the history of warfare, in a span of time that German war colleges would later study as a case in institutional velocity nobody in 1939 had thought possible. Heading: an ocean that would not protect them from American steel. If the first German miscalculation was about soldiers, the second was about steel, and it may have been the most consequential misjudgment of the entire war. German economic planners in the years before Pearl Harbor operated on an assumption baked into their entire strategic posture, that Germany's industrial base, combined with the resources of occupied Europe, gave it a decisive material edge over any power that had to cross an ocean to fight. It was not an unreasonable assumption on its face. Germany controlled the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr, the coal and steel of Lorraine, the factories of occupied Czechoslovakia and France. German engineering had a well-earned reputation for precision. And the United States, for all its size, had spent the interwar years running factories that made refrigerators, automobiles and radios, not tanks and bombers. What German planners underestimated was the astonishing speed with which an economy built for consumer goods could be converted into an economy built for war, and the sheer scale that conversion would reach once American industry committed to it fully. President Roosevelt's call in January 1941 for the United States to become what he termed the arsenal of democracy sounded, to many ears in Berlin, like political theater. It did not sound like theater for long. Within a few short years, American shipyards were launching a new cargo vessel, a Liberty ship, at a rate that eventually reached, at its peak, less than 5 days from keel to launch, with one yard in California famously assembling a ship in under 5 days as a wartime publicity stunt that nonetheless reflected a genuinely staggering baseline production tempo. Over 2,700 of these ships would be built during the war, replacing tonnage that German U-boats were sinking in the Atlantic faster than German naval planners had thought any nation could replace it. The numbers, once German intelligence began compiling them from captured documents and reconnaissance, were difficult for career officers to accept at face value. American factories would go on to produce nearly 90,000 tanks and self-propelled guns over the course of the war. American aircraft plants would turn out close to 300,000 airplanes. Willow Run, a Ford-operated plant in Michigan, was eventually rolling a completed B-24 Liberator bomber off its line at a pace that reached roughly 1 aircraft per hour during its peak production stretches, a manufacturing achievement that, when details reached German Air Ministry officials through intelligence channels, was treated by some with open skepticism, on the grounds that no industrial economy could sustain that tempo for heavy bombers without collapsing under its own weight. It did not collapse. It accelerated. German officers on the ground began to feel the consequences of this production before their superiors in Berlin fully absorbed the intelligence reports describing it. Rommel, fighting in North Africa, complained bitterly in his own correspondence about the sheer quantity of American-supplied material his opponents could bring to bear: fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles arriving in a volume his own logistics train, stretched across hundreds of miles of desert, could never hope to match. A German unit that lost a tank in combat might wait weeks for a replacement to work its way through an overstretched supply chain reaching back to factories in the Reich, factories that were themselves increasingly targeted by Allied bombing. An American unit that lost a tank could often expect a replacement within days, arriving from a supply chain that stretched not just across France but across an entire ocean, sustained by an industrial base that Allied bombing could not effectively touch at all. This asymmetry compounded with every month the war continued. German industry, despite heroic efforts by Armaments Minister Albert Speer to rationalize and expand production even under bombardment, was fighting a battle of subtraction, trying to make do with less steel, less fuel, less skilled labor as the war ground on and Allied bombing campaigns targeted refineries and rail networks. American industry was fighting a battle of addition, adding new plants, new shifts, new capacity, largely untouched by enemy action on the continental United States itself. By 1944, German quartermasters filing requisitions for fuel were often working with fractions of what campaigns actually required, forcing commanders to make brutal choices about which units would move and which would sit idle. American quartermasters, whatever bottlenecks they faced getting supplies from ship to front, and there were serious ones particularly across the beaches of Normandy in the campaign's opening weeks, were drawing from reserves of raw material and finished product that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht's planners had access to. A captured German colonel, interrogated in the closing months of the war, reportedly told his American captors that his greatest miscalculation had not been about American soldiers at all, but about American factories, that he had assumed a nation which had spent the 1930s building washing machines could not possibly retool fast enough to matter before Germany secured its objectives in Europe. He had been given, by his own account, roughly 2 years to be proven wrong. It took considerably less than that. Consider the automobile industry alone. In 1940, Detroit was a city organized entirely around the production of civilian cars, sedans, trucks, the ordinary machinery of American consumer life. Within 2 years, that same city and the vast supplier network surrounding it had become one of the most important military production centers on Earth, turning out tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and artillery pieces at a rate that startled even the American officials who had pushed for the conversion. General Motors alone would go on to produce roughly a tenth of all American war material by value over the course of the conflict. Engines, trucks, ammunition, aircraft parts, tank components, output from a single corporation that exceeded the entire wartime production of some Axis nations. Chrysler built tanks. The Yellow Truck and Coach Company built trucks by the hundreds of thousands, the unglamorous backbone of an army that, unlike its German counterpart, would fight almost the entire European campaign on rubber tires rather than horse-drawn transport. It is a detail modern audiences often overlook, and one that stunned German logisticians at the time. A majority of the German army, even in 1944, still depended on horses to move supplies and artillery, exactly as it had in the previous war, while the American army that faced them was almost entirely motorized, a difference in operational speed and flexibility that mattered on every single day of the campaign. German assessments before the war had assumed that any nation attempting this kind of rapid industrial conversion would face crippling shortages of skilled labor, since so many working-age men were being pulled into uniform. What German planners had not accounted for was the scale at which American industry would draw on a labor pool the Wehrmacht's own economic planners had never seriously considered as a wartime resource. American women, entering factory floors by the millions, building the aircraft, the ships, and the ammunition that kept the arsenal running even as the army overseas swelled past 8 million men. It was, again, not a detail German intelligence had modeled into its pre-war calculations, and it became one more multiplier German officers had to reckon with, campaign after campaign, as they tried and failed to find the ceiling on American production. Heading: Farm boys and factory clerks who learned to kill efficiently. There is a particular kind of condescension that runs through German assessments of the American soldier in the early years of the war, and it is worth sitting with, because it explains so much of what came afterward. The German army of 1939 was built on a foundation the Americans did not share. A long tradition of conscription, of a general staff system that had trained officers with academic rigor since the 19th century, and of a cultural mythology that treated soldiering as a noble vocation rather than an interruption to civilian life. German officers looked at the American replacement system. Young men pulled from farms, department stores, and college classrooms, given a matter of months of training and shipped overseas, and saw exactly what they expected to see: amateurs. And in the earliest engagements, that assessment was not entirely wrong. American units landing in North Africa in late 1942 were, by any honest measure, green. They had trained in the United States against an imagined enemy, using doctrine that had not yet been tested against the reality of German combined arms tactics, dive bombing, and the brutal efficiency of experienced panzer commanders who had already fought through Poland, France, and the opening phases of the war in Russia. Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was a genuine and costly defeat, one that cost American forces men, equipment, and a great deal of confidence. What German officers did not anticipate, what almost nothing in their own military culture had prepared them to expect, was how quickly that inexperience burned off. The American military, for all its late start, had one advantage that the increasingly desperate German replacement system could not match by 1943. It could afford to learn from its mistakes without immediately bleeding out. Officers who failed were relieved rather than left in place out of loyalty or desperation. Tactics that did not work were rewritten within the same campaign season, sometimes within the same week, and pushed back down through training pipelines that reached all the way to stateside bases, so that the next wave of replacements arrived already carrying lessons paid for in another man's blood. By the time American troops fought through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula, then across Normandy's hedgerows in the summer of 1944, German officers facing them in the line were filing after-action reports with a very different tone than the ones written after Kasserine. They noted, often with visible reluctance, an American soldier who improvised well under pressure, who used cover and supporting fire with increasing sophistication, and who, critically, showed an initiative at the small unit level that ran counter to every assumption German training had instilled about a citizen army built on civilian habits of individualism rather than military discipline. That individualism, it turned out, was not a weakness. In the chaos of the Normandy hedgerows, where units were frequently cut off from higher command and forced to make independent decisions in close, disorienting terrain, American squads and platoons demonstrated a capacity for initiative that surprised German defenders accustomed to a more rigidly hierarchical enemy. A German account of the fighting in the Bocage country described, with something close to bafflement, American infantrymen who continued to press and attack effectively even after officers were killed or communication broke down, reorganizing around whichever sergeant or corporal happened to be standing. The American replacement system was, by German standards, alarmingly informal. Men trained stateside, shipped as individuals rather than as cohesive units, and fed into depleted formations wherever the need was greatest. German doctrine treated unit cohesion, built over years of shared training, as sacred, and viewed the American approach as a recipe for disaster. And in some respects it was a genuine weakness. Soldiers arriving as strangers into veteran units sometimes struggled to find their footing quickly, and American commanders themselves would later criticize aspects of the individual replacement system harshly. But the sheer volume of trained manpower flowing through that system meant American divisions could absorb losses that would have gutted a comparable German formation and remain combat effective within weeks rather than months. By the winter of 1944, in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, German officers launching the last great offensive in the West expected American units, caught by surprise and outnumbered in the opening hours, to break. Some did. Many did not. Small, isolated American garrisons, most famously at the crossroads town of Bastogne, but in dozens of less celebrated positions along the front, held ground against German armor and infantry with a stubbornness that disrupted the entire timetable of the offensive. When a German commander sent a demand for surrender to the encircled American garrison at Bastogne, the reply that came back was a single word, blunt enough to become part of American military legend: nuts. It was not the response of an amateur army. It was the response of soldiers who, whatever their civilian origins, had absorbed enough hard-won experience by that point in the war to understand exactly what was at stake in holding that crossroads, and who held it anyway. The farm boys and factory clerks the German officer corps had dismissed in 1942 were, by early 1945, veterans capable of fighting German soldiers who had trained for this profession since adolescence, to something close to a standstill, and frequently to outright defeat. There was also a quieter transformation happening beneath the level of individual soldiers, one that German assessments barely touched at all. The quality of American junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the men who actually translated doctrine into action on the ground. Officer candidate school programs in the United States were, by German standards, remarkably compressed, often producing new second lieutenants in a matter of months rather than years. German observers, evaluating this from a distance through pre-war attaché reports, assumed the result would be exactly what compressed training usually produces: officers who understood procedure but lacked judgment, who could recite doctrine but could not adapt it under fire. What they encountered instead, by the middle years of the war, were young officers who had been selected in part precisely for the qualities that mattered most in the chaos of combat: the capacity to make a fast decision with incomplete information and live with the consequences. American training culture, shaped by a society that valued practical improvisation as much as formal hierarchy, had produced a junior officer corps that, whatever it lacked in academic polish compared to its German counterparts, more than compensated for in adaptability. It was a quality German training, for all its rigor, had never placed at the center of its own officer development, and it showed, again and again in the after-action reports German units filed once the fighting moved from the open plains of North Africa into the close, unpredictable terrain of the European mainland. The guns that arrived before the order to fire was finished. Ask a German veteran of the European campaign decades later what frightened him most about fighting the Americans, and a surprising number did not answer with tanks or with airplanes. They answered with artillery. This was not the answer German pre-war planners would have predicted. Artillery was, in the European military tradition, an area of genuine German strength, a service arm refined over generations, staffed by officers who took enormous pride in the mathematics and craft of indirect fire. American artillery doctrine, by contrast, appeared on paper to be almost unremarkable. Standardized guns, standardized shells, a fire control system that seemed, to an observer steeped in more elaborate European traditions, almost crude in its simplicity. The simplicity was the point, and it was a point German officers did not grasp until they were on the receiving end of it. The American artillery system, refined over the course of the war, allowed a single forward observer, a lieutenant or even a sergeant, often positioned dangerously close to the front line, to call for fire and, through a network of coordinated fire direction centers, bring the combined weight of multiple artillery battalions onto a single target within minutes. The system depended on standardization. American guns fired from a common set of calculations, common ammunition, and a fire direction procedure drilled into gun crews until it became close to reflexive. What this meant in practice was speed. A German unit spotted moving in the open or massing for a counterattack could find itself under accurate, overwhelming fire from dozens of guns before its own commanders had finished issuing orders to respond. German prisoners and captured documents, again and again, singled this system out as something they had not anticipated and had no equivalent answer for. German artillery, though technically excellent in many respects, generally required more time and more centralized coordination to mass fire from multiple units onto a single target, a process that, under the pressure of a fast-moving Western Front campaign and with German communications increasingly disrupted by Allied air power, simply could not keep pace with the American system's responsiveness. The psychological effect on German troops was, by numerous accounts, profound. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured Soviet artillery barrages of staggering scale, still described American fire missions with a particular dread, precisely because of how quickly they arrived and how accurately they landed, often within minutes of a unit being spotted, with little warning beyond the whistle of shells already inbound. This was not an accident of superior German neglect. It reflected a broader American approach to combined arms warfare that emphasized standardization, communication, and the rapid concentration of firepower over the more artisanal, officer-dependent traditions of European artillery practice. It was, in its way, an industrial approach to fire support, built by a nation that had learned to standardize production on assembly lines and applied that same instinct to the battlefield, a doctrine, not an afterthought, and one that German intelligence had simply never rated highly enough to prepare for. By the time of the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest and later in the Ardennes, German commanders were adjusting their own tactics specifically to minimize exposure to American artillery, dispersing formations more widely, moving at night, avoiding daytime concentrations that had proven fatally vulnerable to fire missions that could be called and executed with a speed no one in the German officer corps had believed an American gun crew capable of in 1941. There was also a technological dimension to this that German engineers only fully understood once fragments of the equipment fell into their hands. Late in the war, American ordnance developers fielded a device known as the proximity fuse, a small radio transmitter fitted into the nose of an artillery shell that detected when it was near a target and detonated automatically in the air above it, rather than relying on a soldier's manual timing or a direct ground impact. Against troops caught in the open or against V-1 flying bombs targeting London, this fuse multiplied the lethality of ordinary artillery shells dramatically, showering a wider area with fragments at exactly the height most likely to cause casualties. It was considered such a closely guarded secret that American commanders were, for a long stretch of the war, forbidden from using it over German-held territory at all, out of fear that a single dud shell recovered intact might allow German engineers to reverse engineer the technology. When it was finally cleared for wider use during the Battle of the Bulge, it added yet another layer to an artillery arm that German forces already considered the single most feared branch of the American military they faced, a branch built not around individual genius, but around a standardized, almost industrial system for finding a target and burying it in shellfire before the enemy had time to react. Heading, a two-ocean war the Wehrmacht assumed would break them. There was a piece of strategic arithmetic that German planners found comforting in the years before Pearl Harbor, and it went something like this. No nation, however large its potential, could fight a serious war in the Pacific against Japan and a serious war in Europe against Germany at the same time. The logistics alone, German staff officers reasoned, would force Washington to choose, to commit the bulk of its strength to one theater while holding a defensive posture in the other, most likely prioritizing the Pacific, where the direct attack had come, and leaving Europe to Britain and an increasingly overstretched Soviet Union. It was a reasonable calculation, built on the logistics every professional military in the world understood at the time. It also turned out to be wrong because the American planners who actually set strategy in Washington and London made a decision German wargaming had not seriously accounted for. A formal commitment, agreed upon with the British in the earliest weeks after Pearl Harbor, to defeat Germany first, while fighting a genuinely massive holding and then offensive campaign against Japan simultaneously, rather than sequentially. What made this possible was not a single miracle but the same industrial and organizational capacity German intelligence had already, in other contexts, badly underestimated. American shipyards were not building vessels for one ocean. They were building for two simultaneously, at a pace that allowed the United States Navy to grow from a service that had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor into the largest and most powerful navy in the history of the world within about 3 years, a navy large enough to contest the entire Pacific against Japan while also escorting the convoys that kept Britain fed and armed, and eventually supporting an invasion of Western Europe that required assembling the largest amphibious armada ever put to sea. It was a reasonable calculation, built on the logistics every professional military in the world understood at the time. It also turned out to be wrong because the American planners who actually set strategy in Washington and London made a decision German wargaming had not seriously accounted for. A formal commitment, agreed upon with the British in the earliest weeks after Pearl Harbor, to defeat Germany first, while fighting a genuinely massive holding and then offensive campaign against Japan simultaneously, rather than sequentially. What made this possible was not a single miracle but the same industrial and organizational capacity German intelligence had already, in other contexts, badly underestimated. American shipyards were not building vessels for one ocean. They were building for two simultaneously, at a pace that allowed the United States Navy to grow from a service that had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor into the largest and most powerful navy in the history of the world within about 3 years. A navy large enough to contest the entire Pacific against Japan while also escorting the convoys that kept Britain fed and armed, and eventually supporting an invasion of Western Europe that required assembling the largest amphibious armada ever put to sea. German naval planners, who had a far better appreciation than the Army for how difficult two-ocean logistics actually were, watched this unfold with something closer to alarm than the Army's more dismissive early assessments. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding Germany's U-boat fleet, understood better than almost anyone in the German High Command exactly what American shipbuilding capacity meant for his own campaign to strangle Allied supply lines in the Atlantic, and understood, as 1943 turned into 1944, that his boats were losing a race against a production rate they could not hope to match. Faster than Allied escort tactics were sinking them. The strategic decision to fight Germany first, while simultaneously building the naval and industrial capacity to hold and then roll back Japan in the Pacific, required exactly the kind of sustained, coordinated national mobilization that German assessments of American political culture had insisted the country was too fractured, too commercially minded, and too isolationist to sustain. Instead, the United States sustained it for nearly 4 years, across 2 oceans, without the two-front strain ever forcing the kind of strategic compromise German planners had confidently predicted. By 1944, the evidence of this was sitting in plain sight off the coast of Normandy, in an invasion fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels, and simultaneously half a world away in a Pacific campaign that was pushing methodically closer to the Japanese home islands, supported by its own separate and enormous fleet, its own separate and enormous logistics train, drawing from the same industrial base without either theater being starved to feed the other. German intelligence officers reviewing captured Allied shipping manifests in the final year of the war were, by multiple accounts, stunned less by any single vessel than by the sheer redundancy of the system, the apparent willingness of American planners to build more of everything than seemed strictly necessary, simply because the industrial base allowed it and the strategic situation rewarded it. The scale of this redundancy is worth dwelling on, because it captures something essential about the entire American war effort that German pre-war planning simply had no framework for. American shipyards did not build one class of escort vessel to hunt German submarines. They built several, in overlapping numbers, refining designs even as older ones remained in mass production, because the industrial base could absorb the inefficiency of running multiple production lines simultaneously without meaningfully slowing any of them down. The United States Navy that had been crippled at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, losing or damaging a significant portion of its battleship fleet in a single morning, had by 1944 grown into a force that could simultaneously screen an invasion fleet off Normandy, hunt submarines across the length of the Atlantic, and fight a string of massive carrier battles across thousands of miles of the Pacific against a Japanese navy that had itself, only 2 years earlier, seemed the dominant naval power in that ocean. No German naval planner in 1939 had modeled a scenario in which an adversary could rebuild from that kind of opening blow and still outproduce every other navy on Earth within the same conflict. It was, in the truest sense, the kind of capability that existed nowhere in German pre-war intelligence assessments, because nothing in German industrial experience offered a comparable point of reference. The invasion fleet that should not have been possible. Even after everything German intelligence had learned by the spring of 1944, the production numbers, the growing skill of American infantry, the terrifying speed of American artillery, there remained one strategic assumption the German high command clung to almost until the moment it was shattered, that an amphibious invasion of Fortress Europe, across the English Channel, against fortified defenses, was an operation of such staggering logistical complexity that no combination of Allied planning could execute it successfully, at least not in the near term, and certainly not with the speed and coordination that would actually be required to establish and sustain a beachhead against determined German counterattack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with organizing the coastal defenses of the Atlantic Wall, took the threat seriously enough to drive his engineers relentlessly, but even he operated on assumptions about the scale and sophistication of what was coming that proved to be significant underestimates. German planners debated where the invasion would land, argued about the timing, and disagreed about how quickly Allied forces could be reinforced once ashore, but almost universally, they underestimated the sheer scale of the logistical apparatus the Allies, with American industry and organization at its core, had built to support the landing. The numbers involved in Operation Overlord were, by any standard of military history to that point, unprecedented. Nearly 7,000 vessels. Over 150,000 troops landed on the first day alone, by sea and by air. 2 artificial harbors, built in sections in England and towed across the Channel to be assembled off the Normandy beaches, providing port capacity in places where no natural port existed, so that supplies could keep flowing even before the Allies captured a major harbor city. An underwater fuel pipeline, laid across the floor of the English Channel, designed to feed gasoline directly to the armies fighting their way inland without depending entirely on tanker ships that would be vulnerable to interception and delay. German intelligence had picked up fragments of this preparation in the months before the invasion, but the scale of it, once fully revealed on the morning of June 6, 1944, exceeded what German planning documents had assumed was logistically feasible. A German officer surveying the invasion fleet from the Normandy coastline that morning, according to multiple post-war accounts from men who were there, described a horizon that seemed to be entirely covered in ships, as far as visibility allowed in either direction. A sight that several German defenders later said they had simply not believed possible, even having been warned an invasion was coming. What followed the initial landing was, in some ways, even more revealing of the gap between German assumptions and American capability. Getting men ashore was one thing, German planners had, at least in the abstract, considered that possible. Sustaining and rapidly reinforcing an invasion force against a determined defense, building up combat power on the beachhead faster than German reserves could be brought to bear against it, was the piece German wargaming had judged nearly impossible to execute at the required tempo. Within a month of the initial landings, over 1 million Allied troops had been put ashore in Normandy, along with the vehicles, fuel, and ammunition required to sustain an offensive campaign, a build-up rate that outpaced anything German logistics, hampered by Allied air interdiction of French rail lines and roads, could hope to match in trying to reinforce their own defending divisions. The Mulberry harbors, the fuel pipeline, the meticulously scheduled landing timetables that got specific units onto specific beaches in a specific order to avoid the kind of chaotic bottleneck that had doomed less carefully planned amphibious operations earlier in the war. All of it reflected an organizational sophistication that ran directly counter to the German assumption of American improvisation and disorder. This was not a nation of amateurs stumbling ashore. It was the largest and most carefully coordinated amphibious operation in the history of warfare, built on the same industrial depth and organizational capacity German intelligence had spent years underestimating in every other context. Now applied to the single operation, German strategy had bet almost everything on being impossible to execute. It was executed. And once ashore, it did not stop. The belief that the Americans would not have the stomach to finish it. The final conviction, and in some ways the deepest one, was less about equipment or doctrine than about character. A belief, held at the highest levels of the German government, that the United States, however large its industrial base or however quickly its army learned to fight, was ultimately a soft, comfortable, commercially minded society that lacked the will to sustain a long, costly war fought far from its own shores. This was not a fringe view. It ran through Hitler's own rhetoric about the United States going back years before the war, a conviction that a multi-ethnic democracy, without the racial and ideological cohesion the Nazi regime prized in itself, would fracture under the pressure of sustained casualties, war weariness, and domestic political division. German propaganda through much of the war leaned on this theme, predicting that American public opinion would eventually turn against the cost of the conflict, that isolationist sentiment which had been so strong before Pearl Harbor would reassert itself once casualty lists grew long enough, and that a negotiated peace favorable to Germany would eventually become more attractive to American voters and politicians than the grinding cost of total victory. It is worth acknowledging that this was not a purely irrational hope. American public support for the war effort, while broad, was not without real strain, and there were genuine debates within the United States about strategy, about the human cost of the campaigns, and about how the post-war world should be shaped. German intelligence was not simply inventing a fantasy out of nothing. They were watching a real democracy with real internal disagreements, and betting that those disagreements would eventually produce paralysis or retreat. That bet did not pay off, and the reasons why go to the heart of what this entire story has been about. The same industrial and organizational capacity that had shocked German planners in every other domain, production, logistics, the speed of army building, the sophistication of the invasion of Normandy, was matched by a political and social commitment to the war that proved far more durable than German assessments predicted. Rationing was accepted. War bonds were purchased in enormous volume. Millions of Americans who would never wear a uniform went to work in factories, some for the first time in their lives, sustaining the industrial output that supplied the war on both fronts. Casualty lists, when they came, produced grief, not collapse. Even the German army's last major offensive gamble in the West, the attack through the Ardennes in December 1944, was partly premised on this belief, a hope that a sudden, shocking reversal, inflicting heavy American casualties and threatening to split the Allied armies, might fracture American political will enough to open the door to a negotiated settlement before the war reached German soil. It was, in its way, the final test of the seventh conviction, and it failed as thoroughly as the six that came before it. American units, after the initial shock of the surprise attack, held critical positions, reorganized, and counterattacked within weeks, restoring the front and resuming the advance into Germany itself within a matter of months. By the spring of 1945, as American and other Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the German heartland, the officers who had once dismissed the United States Army as an amateur force fielded by a soft, divided nation were surrendering to it in the hundreds of thousands. Many of them, in post-war interviews, memoirs, and interrogations conducted by American historians and intelligence officers in the years that followed, returned again and again to the same theme. They had simply not believed, in 1939 or 1940 or even 1941, that a country built the way America was built could produce a war effort of this scale, sustain it for this long, and finish it with this much force still in reserve. It was not one single failure of German intelligence. It was a series of them, compounding year over year, each one a conviction that had felt reasonable at the time and had been proven false on a battlefield, in a shipyard, or in the unglamorous arithmetic of a supply depot. 7 things the German officer corps refused to believe. 7 walls, built out of pre-war assumptions about industry, about character, about what a commercial democracy on the other side of an ocean could and could not do, and 7 walls that came down, one campaign at a time, from North Africa to Normandy to the Ardennes to the banks of the Rhine. None of it happened instantly, and none of it happened without real cost. The American army that finished the war in Europe in 1945 was not the same army that had stumbled at Kasserine Pass in 1943, and the distance between those two armies is really the whole of this story, a distance measured in factories converted overnight to war production, in green lieutenants who became hardened company commanders within a single campaign season, in gun crews who learned to bring fire onto a target faster than the enemy could react to it, in dockworkers and engineers who built harbors out of nothing and towed them across a hostile channel, and in a home front that simply did not break in the way German planners had spent years assuring themselves it eventually would. It is tempting, looking back, to see American victory as inevitable, a simple matter of arithmetic, more factories, more men, more ships, more of everything, therefore victory. And the numbers mattered enormously, nothing in this story works without them. But numbers alone do not explain the specific, repeated experience of German officers on the ground, encountering an army that kept exceeding what their training, their doctrine, and their pre-war intelligence had told them to expect. That experience was not just about quantity. It was about how quickly a nation that had genuinely started from very little was able to learn, adapt, and apply what it learned, campaign after campaign, until the gap between American capability and German expectation had become almost impossible to close. The German officer sitting across that table along the Rhine in the spring of 1945 was not a fool, and neither were the men above him who had built an entire strategic doctrine on assumptions about American weakness. They were professionals, operating on the best information available to them, drawing reasonable conclusions from a real history of American military modesty in the years between the wars. They were simply wrong about how fast and how completely that modesty could be left behind once the United States decided the war could not be avoided. That is, in the end, the story worth remembering, not because it flatters national pride, though there is plenty here that does, but because it is a genuine case study in what a democratic, industrial society can do when it commits fully to a task it had spent years telling itself it might never have to face. The German army refused to believe 7 things about the American army. By 1945, belief was no longer required. The evidence was standing on German soil, and it was not going home until the war was over.